Hello there, I'm Brian Taylor. A very warm welcome to the latest live event in the Herald's quite remarkable series tracking Scotland's future. Now, tonight we'll be looking at the question of energy supply, and of course, it could scarcely be more topical. Soaring gas and electricity bills are frankly worrying the life out of consumers. And of course, the issue of energy is at the very core of attempts to sanction Russia over the Ukraine conflict. Should Western Europe, for example, lessen or even end its dependence on Russian gas? The Prime Minister says yes to that, but cautiously, step by step. He was in talks today. Plus, here in Scotland, there's a very active debate about future plans. What about North Sea oil and gas? Leave it in the ground or explore and exploit it further? And how about renewables? Will they guarantee supply? Will the promised jobs materialize? Now, I've got questions in from our subscribers, and many thanks for those, and I'll discuss all that with my expert panel, including those issues raised by you, the Herald's Club of Subscribers. Welcome to you all. I'm joined for the expert panel by Mary Spowage, Director of the Fraser of Allender Institute, by Ewan Gibbs, who's a lecturer on global inequalities at Glasgow University, by Kirsten Jenkins, a lecturer in energy, environment and society at Edinburgh University, and by David Toke, who's Director for Postgraduate Research in Aberdeen University School of Social Science. Welcome all, a very warm welcome all. Let's go right to that issue of the Ukraine conflict, the dreadful, hideous, gross conflict in Ukraine, and the impact it has upon energy supplies, but particularly because of the Russian pipeline of gas. The Prime Minister this afternoon met his Canadian and Dutch counterparts. All three agreed the world should no longer be dependent and reliant upon Russian gas, but Boris Johnson said the change should be taken step by step, not switching off the pipeline right away. We've got a question on that from a subscriber, from Ian Lakin. Ian, thanks for your question. He asks, following the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Western sanctions causing oil and gas prices to surge, surely it's time to extract as much as possible from the North Sea and actively pursue shale gas in England. Who should we go to first? Let's go to Kirsten. Kirsten, does Ukraine change the economics, change the environmental approach, change the approach we take generally towards energy because of that Russian link?
Yeah, I should say I'm wary of whether this is my personal perspective or whether it's a research-led one. So at this stage, I can only offer my personal reflections and say that, it makes us greatly aware, obviously, of a number of different challenges. It makes us acutely aware of supply links and international trade and our dependency on other countries. But for me, no, personally, that does not mean that we shut it off overnight either, and that we forget that we have a climate crisis coming. There's a short-term challenge and there's a long-term challenge, and both of those must be equally weighed against each other. So it's something that drives our energy policy, but it's something that we have to think very carefully and reflexively about as it does so.
Thanks for that. David Toke, what's your take on this? We have the Russian gas pipeline. We have the issue of what to do with our own domestic output.
Well, this emphasizes the need to reduce fossil fuel consumption, particularly of natural gas. And that means reduce it.
I see.
It doesn't mean increase the supply in some sense. So we can do that by bringing online alternative non-fossil supplies, for which there is enormous resources in Scotland for wind power and solar power as well, as a matter of fact. And it emphasizes the need to, as rapidly as possible, reduce demand, whereas at the same time delivering very good energy services. And this emphasizes the need for action on building standards, regulations, both new and existing ones, and getting the latest energy efficiency equipment.
But on the subject of the Russian gas supplies, we just can't. You're saying physically cut them off right now, even though that would be a tremendous sanction upon Russia. You're saying we need to reduce demand, but that isn't going to happen overnight, is it? Or even over a month or years.
Well, we hardly get any Russian gas. I think.
No, indeed, no. But I meant Western Europe collectively. Yeah.
I think what little we were getting,
Germany in particular,
dispense with. But the people who have to make the sacrifices on that are, for instance, Italy, which gets 100% of its natural gas from Russia. Germany, which gets almost half of its natural gas from Russia. And other Eastern European states. Now, we seriously say from this country, this is one thing. Well, we're not going to make any sacrifices. We're just going to make a bit more money out of getting a bit more gas from various places so that our industries can make some money. And you lot in Germany and Italy, you have to go bankrupt. No, come on. Okay. I mean, look, if we are serious about telling people you must stop taking Russian gas, we have to stand shoulder to shoulder with them in making a very big short-term sacrifice.
A huge short-term sacrifice.
Yes. Are we going to do that? No, we're not.
Bring in Mary and then you.
That's the sad truth of it.
Forgive me, David. Bring in Mary and then you on this Russian gas question, and then we'll expand it into what Scotland does with the North Sea. Mary first.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we have to remember that the issues with the gas price, whilst they've been exacerbated and will continue to be by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, were rising quite remarkably before that as well. And a lot of that was to do with the worldwide wish to decarbonise their economies. So a lot of switching from coal to gas in many countries around the world in order to generate cleaner energy than using coal. And that's one of the drivers for the price rising over the course of last year.
Yeah.
And, we've seen huge stress on businesses who have managed to get through COVID, and their prices have been increasing in lockstep with the wholesale price because they don't have an energy cap. So all of these things have been happening previously, and were a number of different factors colliding to make the situation where the gas price was historically very, very high. And then we have this further issue, which is likely to further increase prices. So to a certain extent, I don't think we can move from the path of decarbonising our economy because of this. Interesting. Actually, on the contrary, it shows that what David said, as rapidly as possible, reduce our demand on fossil fuels. We still need to do that, but it is a long play. So many households, so many businesses, so much of our infrastructure is set up to run off these fossil fuels that it really will take time to move away from them.
So it's a long play. That's important. Ewan, what's your take on this?
I think one of the important elements of this crisis is a reminder that how politicised energy markets are, that states are key players. And I think something that's interesting about it is it's a reversal of the position in the 1970s when the oil producers effectively sanctioned the oil consumers by quadrupling the oil price over 73.4. This time, the gas consumers are attempting to sanction the gas producer, and that's interesting. And it's a reminder that consumers also have potentially considerable power in energy markets. It's not just the producer. In terms of the immediate question, I mean, it would take time. Like, energy infrastructure takes considerable time to construct. I think the idea that taking more gas out of the North Sea, or heaven forbid, even worse in my view, taking out of the Central Belt or in England would not provide a solution to the current crisis. And I think I agree with David that it would actually entrench the place of gas in the UK's energy system. I would also add, we're talking about relatively small amounts by the terms of European consumption, so it wouldn't serve to displace, Italian or German demand for Russian gas.
So when you hear people saying, "Why are we buying Russian gas?" and when they are inflicting these horrors upon Ukraine, the answer is that Western Europe is dependent upon it and needs it.
Well, yes, I mean,
David,
Boris Johnson stood up in the House of Commons and said, "We're going to ration natural gas. Every household must consume 20% less," which they'll probably actually, to be honest, people probably can't afford to pay them prices, but even 20% less than that in order to be have solidarity with our German, Italian, and Bulgarian peoples. There'd be uproar. You think that? No, but people aren't saying that. They're just making rhetorical statements here, there, and everything. And by the way,
up for Ukraine,
people talking about they want to lessen the planning regulations on shale gas in England, so that you ignore minor earthquakes and so on.
Yeah. Well, shale was mentioned by Ian Lake in our original question. Please carry on, David. Yeah,
but that's pretty ironic, because many of the same people who are arguing that have supported what amounts to an effective total ban on onshore wind farms in England, and yet onshore the power that onshore wind farms produce, new ones, you can give them developers fixed price contracts for £50 per megawatt hour. The price of electricity from gas at the moment is £200 per megawatt hour. So what's 50 taken away from 200? It's a hell of a saving. So it's a crazy argument some people are coming out with.
Let's narrow it back down then to the black gold, the black oil that was seen as during some of the arguments about independence as being Scotland's salvation, is now seen as being to some extent an ecological embarrassment. And then is there maybe a position in the middle? Question from Callum McLean. In a world, he says, thanks for your question, Callum, where energy sources are volatile and sometimes even from questionable suppliers, why should Scotland and the UK not maximize our local capability to meet our own energy needs? Mary, what's the future of North Sea oil? Does the current crisis change the arithmetic, or is it still the case that we need to drive towards renewables and, frankly, leave this stuff in the ground?
Well, obviously there are different views, but the oil market is a global market. But if we look at what we use in the UK as opposed to what we take out of the North Sea, it isn't the case that we sort of extract enough to meet our demand at the moment, and we're importing oil and particularly gas from other places. So, I still think I don't see why the current crisis changes the discussion around that. Some have said perhaps it does because more revenues could be generated from oil and gas.
Oil at $110 a barrel,
than we had perhaps expected, given that, the prices being down at, $50-$60 a barrel made that much less of a revenue generator. But it's still going to be declining. It's still going to be disappearing from the coffers at some point. And we have committed in statute to climate change reduction targets, with which that is completely.
But if oil is $110 a barrel, shouldn't we maximize the opportunity that perhaps presents by, for example, opening up the Cambo field, opening up other exploratory opportunities? Deirdre Meehy, writing in the Herald from the Offshore Energies UK, says oil and gas is still crucial. Mary, then Kirsten Jenkins.
I mean, I think if, as we have said a few months ago, we want to be a leader in this in the world, we said this at COP, then I don't think that that's a serious suggestion to do that and to still be seen as that sort of moral leader in the world on this.
Kirsten, you're nodding your head at that one.
Yeah, very enthusiastically. I think I agree exactly with that statement. If we've just hosted COP26 and we claim to be leaders in this field, then we have to be so bold as to show what that action looks like. I think Mary's right as well that this is declining. There isn't a continued future for hundreds of thousands of years, and so we need to recognize that this transition is happening. Saying that, I don't think it will happen overnight. I think it will happen over decades probably, and we need it to take that much time, in part so that we protect the people that work in this industry in Scotland and so that they get the just transition that they deserve.
Do we almost, Kirsten, make it slightly difficult for ourselves by leaving the stuff in the ground and therefore accelerating that push towards renewables? I think Michael Matheson, who's the Net Zero and Energy Cabinet Secretary, has got a speech tomorrow in Glasgow to a renewables energy conference, and I think he will say that we need to drive on to renewables. He says he sees the sums on oil, but we still need to drive on to renewables. Kirsten, what are you saying on that? Kirsten, then Ewan.
Yeah, I agree. The harder we make it for ourselves, the quicker we'll do it. And we don't yet have the alternatives that we can step into. To be clear, the scale of the renewables industry is really ambitious and positive in Scotland, but not as big as it needs to be to save all of those workers from becoming redundant. So we need to massively upscale ambition. And one way of doing that is by making ourselves really, really think hard about leaving oil in the ground, in my opinion.
Ewan, then David on this topic of North Sea oil. Ewan Gibbs first, please.
I think one of the situations that's worth acknowledging here in a global context is that throughout a lot of the second half of the 20th century, there was real concerns that there wasn't going to be enough oil. Sly and the Family Stone sang there's only so much oil in the ground. And we're now in a situation where globally there's actually far, far, far too much oil. There's enough oil to end the world as we know it through climate change. So the paradoxes of environmentalism have shifted a lot, and that shapes the discussion we're having here. I think part of what Kirsten alluded to that's really important is the plight of the workforce, but also the long term, that the existing oil wells can extract a lot of oil. If we start to license more fields for extraction, for instance, if we began with Cambo, that's going to take decades to pay off. So that's not a bet on the next 10 years of the current oil price. That's a bet on the very long term, which I agree with Kirsten. We can't environmentally sustain that. And it's not actually going to provide the platform for shifting towards a more sustainable energy economy. I'll let David come in a second. The other thing I wanted to add is I think the real concern I have with renewables from that perspective is the amount of energy we generate from renewables is multiplied in recent years, but the workforce is at best stagnated, and that's a real concern about industrial policy making in Scotland.
Going to come with that, David, on this question of North Sea oil. Leave it in the ground, exploit it further. Where are you standing on this one?
Well, the point is, excuse me, there's a guy from I had some solar panels installed today by coincidence, and a guy from the company is trying to ring me up. He wants me to pay them. Anyway, I've gotten a good excuse for the moment, but I'll have to pay him soon. But anyway, that's what the sort of thing that we ought to be doing in the cheapest possible way, cutting demand for oil and gas. Obviously, if there's no demand for it, it won't happen. It's that simple. And we're having this debate, and yet we're not doing the simplest things what a lot of people would regard as no-brainers. For instance, at the moment, there are houses being put up all the time that use gas boilers and don't have any solar panels on them.
I think that radiator behind you there is
having a surreal conversation here.
Is that radiator behind you?
We're not even doing the basic cheap things, and it is really cheap to install them, to install heat pumps and also solar PV.
You've got one, I believe.
We're not doing it. That's the point that I want to make.
Okay,
we're not doing. We're having this general discussion, and we're not doing anything. We are doing some things, but we're not doing the simple things.
What you're going to have to go and do is pay that bill, but maybe not immediately. Just stick at the general discussion for now, if you would. While Ewan goes to look out his Sly and the Family Stone album as well, we can get that together. Look, the reason we talk about oil price, the reason we talk about gas supplies, the reason we talk about prices is because it's by no means an academic subject. It is a subject that is inflicting disastrous problems for families and consumers across the planet and right here in Scotland. And Kirsten, you drew attention to the fact that it is those already potentially close to fuel poverty who will feel it worse. And we quote from your Herald article, the danger you see is, quote, a perfect storm for the fuel poor and vulnerable that demands rapid, systematic policy action. Explain to me expand upon what you meant by that, Kirsten.
Yeah, I think we as consumers, and I say we as in someone that's feeling this myself at the moment, are being squeezed from every angle, being squeezed on every bill that we pay, and seeing the impacts of not only the Russian-Ukrainian crisis, but a number of other changes in our energy systems that are kind of pushing us to our limits. And what I mean by systematic policy action is effectively that we go beyond little bandages that give us a temporary loan or a temporary rebate, and that more systematically look across the energy system from the way that we price our energy, from the technologies that we're choosing, and from the demand side issues that David's heightening or mentioning the need for awareness of, to make sure that we're looking at this in a bigger picture. Fuel poverty isn't just caused by how we use energy in our homes. It's caused by ripples all across the system. And I don't see that the way that the independence debate is happening acknowledges that explicitly enough.
But presumably in the interim, what you describe as a bandage, a sticking plaster, has to be applied because of the extent of the increase that individual customers are facing.
It can be applied. It can be a bigger bandage with better blood-soaking properties, I think, to use a dodgy analogy. I think it can be applied in a more potentially targeted mechanism, and it can be more far-reaching than it already is. So I push for ambition in that regard as well, and for continued acknowledgement that this isn't something that's happening now that's going to be in the media for a few weeks. It's something that we're projecting to be an issue for months to come. And so that bandage isn't big enough.
I'm going to bring in Ewan and just chuck into the mix a question, and thanks for it, Andrew, from Andrew McMillan, asking if we agree with him that energy supply in the UK will in the very near future need to be in the hands of the UK government, I guess we could say, in the Scottish government, if we're talking about an independent scenario. The reason he says it has to be nationalised is because he says it's becoming clear that the price of gas and electricity is going to rise considerably, and very many people will simply be unable to meet those costs. So you have this rising cost projection that Kirsten's explaining. Do we need to take that sort of radical step of nationalisation of the energy companies, or can we do it by different policy means? You and then Mary.
And I would favour public ownership of some sort, especially if we're going to be handing huge sums of money to energy companies, which we in effect have been. And I think that merits at minimum some sort of a public stake. And I actually think this also matches in with the broader discussion about transition. So, if we want to move out of every home having a gas boiler, for instance, I don't think that's going to be possible on the basis of nudging and trying to incentivize individual householders to do the right thing. I think we need to take some sort of much more radical public action to make that happen. We did do that in the past when we had a publicly owned national gas industry and a publicly owned electricity generating industry in the 1960s and 70s. We quite rapidly moved out of town gas that was generated by coal to natural gas, which was a form of decarbonisation in effect. It wasn't phrased like that at the time, but it was a far less dirty fossil fuel option. And I think we need action like that now. And I think that has to involve some sort of public action. I feel that that's a troublingly absent feature of the independence discussion, actually, in the broader debate around energy in Scotland. I, in some ways, find it astonishing that a nationalist movement is content for governments around the world to own large portions of Scottish renewables, but not to have its own stake in the generation side of things.
As you said in your Herald article, Mary, do we need that level of change, or can something be done with the existing structure of ownership and supply in order to ameliorate the situation for consumers and who are facing real problems? Mary Spyage.
I think in terms of investment in the housing stock and the building stock in Scotland, I mean, that is one of the biggest challenges, along with decarbonising our transport system, that we need to deal with. And the pace of change is just not good enough. Every single report we see about what will be enough to meet our climate targets, or what will be enough to avoid dangerous levels of warming, or even more dangerous levels of warming than we've already had, says actually what we thought is it's even worse. And so the scale and the pace of change needs to absolutely, it just needs to get much faster. And a lot of this is going to involve significant government investment. But the thing is, if we don't spend it now, it's going to cost us way more money in the future. All of the projections about how much additional adaptation or coping with climate change is going to cost us is that will be much more in the future. I know it's difficult because it's a long-term issue.
Yeah,
but we
it's difficult because of the costs of COVID being, we're coping with an economic crisis prompted by the hideous plague, and then we have this other one on top of it. People will be wondering how on earth we cope with those together.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you see businesses who have struggled through the pandemic. Now they're telling us things like, we're not sure we're going to be able to keep operating because our energy prices are so high. The resilience of the business space in Scotland has been tested just as it has across the UK. So yeah, absolutely, it does feel a bit like it's sort of misery upon misery right now. I would agree.
Kirsten, I'll put one to you from Dr. Roddy Yar of Strathclyde University. Just summarise what he's saying. He's concerned about communities not having a say and access to community energy, power and heat. He wants to focus on community empowerment in this case. Literally, is that feasible? Is that feasible at all? Is that workable, Kirsten?
Yeah, this is very unprofessional, but I know Roddy, so hello, Roddy. Oh. It's been a long time. I think
hello to him. Say hello to him. Yeah.
Hi, Roddy. From the University of St Andrews back when. I think it has to be part of the picture. When we're talking about this nationalisation of energy infrastructure, the thing that comes up in my mind is as much around flexibility and prosumption. So prosumption being where people are producing and using at the same time. And our nationalised energy systems didn't do that in the past. That's the bit that's new. That's the bit that's intriguing. And it's the bit where consumers take on a new role in the energy system, feed in via David's solar panel, perhaps, and get feed-in tariffs or whatever the most recent version of them will be. And so I think we really, really do need to push on that, to see that as a way of having resilience, to use that as a battery storage infrastructure in a way that it hasn't been used before, and to use that to integrate our energy systems where cars aren't just transport vectors anymore, but they're fundamentally part of domestic living and community living in a new way.
I see. I'm bringing David in a second. Mary, were you keen to come back in there? Yeah. No, you welcome, David. Then I'll bring you back in a second. David, your take on this? Do we need to change the structure of energy provision?
I'm certainly in favour of more community engagement, community-owned energy enterprises of various shapes and sizes, and I'm certainly in favour of intervention in energy markets regulation that helps achieve our decarbonisation objectives and producing cheaper energy for the consumer. And I mean, I'll give you an example of that. A lot of energy companies have been railing about the energy price cap.
Yes.
And fair enough, we want one that allows that allows good companies, well-run companies, to survive and make a bit of money, but we want one that achieves our general social and environmental objectives as well. Yeah. And to get to the point I wanted to make here, the latest renewable energy contracts, such as types of feed-in tariff contracts called contracts for difference, give fixed prices. And of course, other energy can be sold to get the current very high market rate. And so issuing these fixed price contracts, deciding the prices, can save consumers a lot of money, because the new wind power schemes are very cheap compared to the price of electricity from other sources. And in order to make sure that the electricity suppliers give these savings to the consumers, then we need a price cap, so that Ofgem will take these savings made by the energy suppliers into account when setting the prices. So we need that sort of intervention that achieves clear aims. And yes, we also need grassroots programs, because there's an awful lot of innovation there. Okay. I'm not so sure about this top-down traditional notion of nationalisation. Apart from anything else, this puts whoever happens to be the incumbent big producers in the driving seat, and they tend to dominate policy because there's nothing to stop them. There's no cost incentives, no competition to stop them. So they just dictate policy all the time.
Hang on a second, David. Hang on a second. You mentioned renewables. Let's stick with that. We had Ewan, in your article, you talked about the leasing auction in January 2022, Scott Wind, and you expressed concerns, didn't you, Ewan, in your article that Scotland didn't maximize the gain from North Sea oil, and the same could happen with renewables, particularly offshore wind. What was your thinking there?
Well, in relation to oil, there's several different elements to that, but it's partly that comparable countries such as Norway in particular ensure that there was a public stake in the extraction of oil and invested profits from oil in a sovereign wealth fund. The UK chose not to do that. And the
SNP have complained long and hard about it and made an issue. But on the subject of wind turbines, you're concerned that the Scotland doesn't necessarily reap the direct benefits as well of that.
Yeah, my big concern there is less directly about the revenue, I guess. That is part of it. And if these wind turbines are owned in private hands largely, and or certainly state hands from other countries, then the electricity revenue is going to be generated and enjoyed privately for the most part. But it also related to that question of the supply chain that Kirsten was raised earlier. That actually, in other countries, and Norway's oil industry is an example of this, but also other nations in Europe that have renewable industries also have what are called content agreements. So to build turbines and then to use them in that nation, you need to actually
okay, we'll move to.
We didn't look into.
Oh, he's back in the room.
Oh, sorry about that.
No, forgive me. I think we'll move on to Mary, if I may. Just hang on a second. You move on to Mary. Mary, your colleague at Fraser of Allender, James Black, was saying that renewables will need pretty significant government support. Are you optimistic? I mean, I think it was former First Minister Alex Salmond said Scotland could be the Saudi Arabia of renewables, and yet we have skepticism now about the number of jobs coming in from green energy. We have skepticism about whether the turbines themselves can be sourced and built in Scotland, whether the industry in fact will benefit Scotland other than through the energy supply, whether we can gain economically. What's your thinking on that?
Yeah, I think those who designed the latest leasing round would say that perhaps they tried to ensure that the people who were successful in bidding for these contracts put in place a sort of feasible, realistic supply chain development plan in order to ensure that we didn't make the mistakes we maybe made a decade ago or so, in order to sort of maybe do a lot of the kind of the initial research and development on renewable technologies, but then a lot of the scale up happened in other countries, and now we don't have the capacity or the depth to be able to produce the component parts. So I think there will be a hope that mistake isn't made again, and that we do develop that supply chain. But we do have an issue of capacity, and alongside the development of these developments offshore, we'll need to ensure that we're investing in the skills and the capability in our population to be able to fulfill these roles. And given the tightness of the labour market at the moment, and probably in the years to come, given our demographic outlook, that does look quite challenging, to be honest. And there's going to have to be a lot of investment in those skills to make sure we have that pipeline of people who are not only, who have the skills to work in these supply chain industries that we want to develop.
We had another article, Neil Commode from European Marine Energy Centre, talking up the advantages of tidal if it's handled properly. He was talking about the example in Orkney, and you're nodding your head at that one. You think that's a good thing to argue for, yeah?
Well, yes. I mean, as far as support for renewables is concerned, a lot of support went in the past, and it's been very successful in that the cost. It's been an international effort, but it's been successful internationally in bringing the price of wind power and solar power, and things like batteries, down tremendously, and now they're very cheap. You still hear people, surprising, you still hear people say, oh, we don't want more wind farms or solar farms because they require such massive subsidies. Look, no, it's fossil fuels that are much more expensive these days. They got it totally the wrong way around. Now, in between doing that, yes, whether you've got new technologies, like, for instance, floating wind turbines,
yes,
and wave and tidal, yes, some seed corn funding needs to be given to them to create the initial markets so that they can then develop. And again, that's an international effort. But the main course is still, the conventional wind farms and solar power, which are really bringing or should be bringing the cost down. Now here, yes, skills. Again, there's a slightly surreal discussion being made of hammering these big companies that aren't employing as many local workers as they should. But are we really doing very much or enough to upskill people? Even in things like heat pumps, we're going to need a big expansion in the number of heat pumps. How many heat pump engineers have we got? Not enough. Are we putting enough money into
everybody's going to say no to them and say, I like my gas boiler.
Let's do that. That's
okay, David,
a no-brainer, but it's not.
Thanks, David. Let's bring in Kirsten. You were bringing you on this take. Why aren't we getting the green energy jobs? Why isn't it becoming the revolution that was talked about? Maybe we have to give it some time, but the green jobs just don't appear to be there in the numbers. And we have Ros Foyer, the general secretary of the STUC, stressing the value of jobs that are currently there in the North Sea.
Yeah, thanks. I've been waving subtly for anyone that's watching. We had a prior agreement that I could do that. I'm not just waving. Yeah.
What you're waving your old chum that put the question in. No, carry on.
Exactly. I think it's a fundamental question. Partly goes back to what I said earlier, is I don't think that we have the kind of scale of renewables that we need to sustain the jobs. There's no parity between the oil and gas sector and the renewable sector in terms of its employability. But also something that I think is really critical here, and it's something that's only taken a small part of our debate, is the way that we conceptualize what it is to work in this area. We've talked a huge amount about supply here, but we haven't talked about demand. We haven't talked about involving those people in installing smart meters, in replacing gas boilers, in phasing out oil tanks in the home. And I really do think, as David said earlier, that if we reconceptualize this as a system-wide issue and that we put emphasis on energy reduction, energy saving, energy redistribution, then we can think more systematically about those types of policy options that I mentioned in my article.
Okay. I'm going to move to, and I said, I'm going to move to nuclear as well. Question from David Gilzine, gosh, the name of a very famous Dundee forward, a wonderful player. I shouldn't have gone down that road, but I'm always diverted into football. David Gilzine, thanks for your question, David. He says, to avert being shackled to other countries for energy requirements, will the green bullet be swallowed, and will we have an unemotional debate about nuclear power, fracking for gas and oil production? What do you think of that one, David? What do you think of that one? Nuclear and fracking. Have an unemotional debate about it. Face it. Prime Minister today in his speech saying he's going to be setting out energy policy, and he's got it in the coming days. But he said there had to be a big role for nuclear. What's your take on that, David Toke?
Well, I've already made some comments about shale gas. It'll produce very expensive product because it's sold on global prices, the same as liquefied natural gas. So it certainly won't reduce our energy prices. Whereas in England, reversing the ban on onshore wind will produce a lot more, much cheaper energy schemes. As for nuclear, I think there's some risks for Scotland here if it decided, oh, well, let's have one of Sizewell C and call it, I don't know, Torness B or something, or whatever you want to call it, in that it could be very dangerous financially for Scotland to take that on, because the only way the British government thinks it's going to financing it, it'll end up with the government paying basically EDF. They say they're going to get private investors. Well, they won't. It'll be either the government paying for it completely or guaranteeing the profits of a lot of big companies by underwriting the inevitable massive cost overruns you have in building these power stations and loading them onto the consumer. Now imagine that happens with Scotland agrees to take that on, and then it becomes independent. It would be catastrophic for its finances. So Scotland should steer clear from any of these nuclear.
Thanks for that. Ewan, I saw you nodding. I'd just say, the First Minister said this week a definite no to nuclear build upon low carbon renewables, and that's actually a position of First Ministers going back down the line. I think it was Jack McConnell had this sort of tentative agreement with the UK on understanding with the UK government that Scotland would do the renewables, which can be controversial as well. And it was no to new nuclear in Scotland. Is there at all a future for new nuclear? Ros Foyer again of the STUC regrets the absence of new nuclear in the mix. Ewan.
Well, I think my answer is fairly obvious.
No, hang on, David. Ewan, please.
I mean, I think we need to see that in the context of the formation of an anti-nuclear political consensus in Scotland in the second half of the 20th century. Both the nationalist movement and the Labour movement came to an anti-nuclear position for somewhat different reasons. In the Labour movement, that was partly actually an attachment to coal historically. But it was also about the sense, and that this rings with what David was saying, that nuclear was being foisted on Scotland where it was unpopular, and where proposals for nuclear waste dumping were also unpopular, and there still aren't fully worked out solutions for storing nuclear waste, that it has to be said. But I think the other argument here is the question was asked in terms of economic sovereignty, but at the moment, or energy sovereignty, at the moment nuclear power stations are going to be they were being built by the Chinese until they got effectively thrown out of the contract. They're now being built by the French government, in effect, at Sizewell. Like the current programme of nuclear power station building is not one for energy sovereignty. I would also concur with David that it's not an economic proposition, especially as renewable energy falls in economic proposition in the UK.
Ewan, thanks. Mary, I want to get a couple more in. We're really almost out of time. Another article in the Herald, Alistair Phillips Davis, Chief Exec of SSE, said for renewables to work, and he's punting it, he says his company are involved in that, it needs urgent investment in the transmission infrastructure. Mary, then Kirsten, on that, are we missing a point that it's all very well generating the stuff, we need to get it to the markets? Mary,
yeah, absolutely. And it's the reverse of a lot of fossil fuel stations, which are close to large population centres. These are generally being generated in much more rural areas of Scotland who aren't going to be able to use all of the energy that's generated. And so we have to have transmission infrastructure that's built for that. And also so you don't get lots of people very cross in Orkney or something because lots of power is being generated, but they're paying extra than people on the mainland for the power. That's just not fair. So yeah, the transmission network and infrastructure definitely needs to be sorted out.
Kirsten, I saw you nodding when I raised that as a topic as well.
Yeah, again, enthusiastically agree. I mean, these subsea interconnectors are totally lacking. Ari just mentioned Orkney being the prime example of somewhere that generates more energy than it can use, but also that has the highest rates of fuel poverty across some of the Scottish islands. And so, again, that's an example of where if you planned source to sink, you would resolve many of the issues that our island and rural communities in particular are facing.
And the final one I want to bring up is carbon capture and storage. Again, it's again in the Herald article, Alistair Phillips Davis of SSE. He's backing that. He said plus hydro, etc. Who wants to argue or tell me about carbon capture and storage? Hands up. Who's first? Go on then. Go on, Kirsten. You're looking keen.
I'm just laughing because if my
he's laughing at it, right? Who wants to
Stuart Hazeldine was here, he would love that question.
Who wants to talk about carbon capture and storage? David, that must be your area of expertise, is it?
Well, I see it as a diversion. It's not going anywhere. It's just going to waste a lot of people's time and give people false hopes. Is my summary.
Anybody want to speak up for it? Then we have a go. No. Okay. Chums, I'm going to draw that to a close. Thank you very, very much indeed for all your contributions. They were excellent. As I say, I'll leave Ewan to go off and rake through his record collection, and David to go off and pay the bill for that wonderful new energy system that he's got in his house. Really terrific thanks to all four taking part in the panel today. Huge thanks to those of you who sent in the subscribers who joined us, particularly those subscribers who sent in questions. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to all of them, but I hope we got a decent representative sample sprinkled throughout the program. Watch for more on the Scotland's Future series in the Herald. It's been quite incredible stuff so far, and I'm sure there's more to come. From me, Brian Taylor, toodaloo the new.